I drove the plow in virgin soil, my weary feet the furrow trod. At last I gathered golden grain, 'twas mine hard-earned by toil and pain. I carried rock from granite hill, laid stone on stone till giant mill transformed my grain to tempting food.
The late 19th century and early 20th century saw a dramatic shift in the way of life for Americans. Urbanization, industrialization, standardization rocked the country. Railroads connected the nation, opening doors to broader markets for goods and bigger business. By 1890, the American frontier had been completely settled, and urban areas saw unprecedented growth. Small, independent businesses were pushed aside by the large factories of the day. Business grew larger and larger, industrializing and mechanizing to produce product as quickly and cheaply as possible. The mass production called for large numbers of unskilled laborers. Between 1880 and 1910, about 11 million Americans moved from rural areas to the cities. And millions of immigrants flooded in from Southern and Eastern Europe as part of the new wave of immigration, mostly settling in cities where native-born Americans looked down on them as inferior, to work in the factories and sweatshops. Women and children could be paid less than their male counterparts, and in the year 1900, 1/5 of factory workers were women, double the numbers in 1880. In the 1890s, just 45% of Americans lived above the poverty line. Unregulated big business tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller built up huge corporations known as trusts that monopolized markets and centralized power, frightening the American public. Under the government's handoff policy, workplace conditions grew dangerous, and big businessmen got rich off the backs of the increasingly oppressed poor. All these problems set the stage for what was the greatest reform movement since the 1840s. Between the years 1901 and 1912, a great outcry rose up from religious groups, radical politicians, writers, and social reformers. Progressives who waged the war against the injustices and institutionalized abuses of the times.
How little do the rich men care when they sit at home secure. What dangers all the workers dare, and the hardships they endure.
By the year 1900, 30% of America's population lived in cities. The ever-expanding urban life was good for middle-class workers, who were beginning to enjoy higher wages and consequently more leisure time. They benefited from the convenience the city offered, in the form of shopping centers, department and chain stores, amusement parks, baseball stadiums, recreational parks, and improved infrastructure that catered toward middle and upper-class citizens. But for the poor working-class Americans who flocked to the cities to work in factories, lured by visions of freedom, consumerism, and a better life, urbanization offered little but a life of toil and deterioration of human dignity. Wages were barely high enough to get by, and by 1904, an estimated 1 in 3 city dwellers were close to starving to death. Life in the slums was marked by poor lighting, foul air, lacking infrastructure, the constant danger of fire, overcrowding, bad water, disease, and dirtiness. In the year 1900, about 70% of New Yorkers lived in tenement houses. A typical New York City tenement was 25 foot wide and 90 foot deep. living 10 foot in the back of the building so that the people living there could get some light. Hallways were dark, and only the rooms in the front or back received any light or air. There were typically 14 rooms on a floor, 10 of which had no access to the outside. These rooms served 4 families. A family might pay $12 to $18 in rent a month for 2 10 by 12 foot rooms and 2 7 by 9 foot rooms in the front, or $10 to $15 for 3 of the center rooms. In the summer, conditions were often so unbearable that the people slept on the roofs of the buildings. Jacob Riis wrote of the tenement houses in his muckraking book, How the Other Half Lives.
Be a little careful, please. The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Kicks and cuffs are their daily diet. They have little else. Here where the hall turns and dives into utter darkness is a step, and another. All the fresh air that ever entered these stairs comes from the hall door that is forever slamming, and from the windows of dark bedrooms that in turn receive from the stairs the sole supply of the elements God meant to be free. That was a woman filling her pail by the hydrant he just bumped against. The sinks are in the hallway, that all the tenants may have access, and all be poisoned alike by their summer stenches. Hear the pump squeak. It is the lullaby of the tenement house babes. In summer, when 1,000 thirsty throats pant for a cooling drink in this block, it is worked in vain. Here is a door. Listen. That short, hacking cough, that tiny, helpless wail. With half a chance it might have lived, but it had none. That dark bedroom killed it. We grope our way up the stairs and down from floor to floor. Step carefully over this baby. It is a baby, spite of its rags and dirt. This gap between dingy brick walls is a yard. That strip of smoke-colored sky up there is the heaven of these people. Here is a room neater than the rest. The woman, a stout matron with hard lines of hair in her face, is at the washtub. I try to keep the children clean, she says, apologetically, but with a helpless glance around. The spice of hot soap suds is added to the air already tainted with the smell of boiling cabbage, of rags and uncleanliness all about. It is Thursday, but patched linen is hung upon the pulley line from the window. There is no Monday cleaning in the tenements. It is wash day all week round, for a change of clothing is scarce among the poor.
The working conditions of the lower class were dubious. With no government agencies to regulate industrial practices and working conditions, work days were often long and hazardous. Injury and death were common, and the big companies made it their practice to exploit workers. In the anthracite coal mining industry, where child labor was known to take place in the early 20th century, working conditions were so bad that between 1870 and 1901, 10,318 workers were killed and 27,311 were injured on the job. Companies got rich both on the work done by the cheap labor and on the exploitation of the laborers. Or as the workers said it according to John Mitchell in 1903, many of the companies earned the money not only by mining coal, but by mining miners. Miners had to pay for the blasting powder they used on the job at inflated prices. While a keg of blasting powder normally cost $1.10, miners had to pay operators $2.75 for each keg they used. It seemed that operators were always looking for ways to pay their workers less. Those who paid workers by the ton of coal ore, which is technically 2,000 pounds, were known to consider quantities weighing as high as 3,190 pounds of coal ore to be a ton. Then operators, who paid by the cart, often increased the size of the cart or forced workers to pile the coal up above the top so that they could pay them less. Operators could further reduce workers' pay by simply claiming that the load was too light or contained impurities. Often, miners were given scrip as pay rather than money that could be used in company stores where low-quality goods were sold at inflated prices. That way, a worker could go months without being paid in real cash, and at the end of it all, owe the company money for purchases he had made at the store. Such exploitation was common in sweatshops and industries across the country, making it hard, if not impossible, for impoverished workers to get ahead enough to make better lives for themselves.
When toiling millions work to fill, the wealthy call for strong. When hands are crushed that work can fill, there must be something wrong. Old John Henry told his captain,
in 1902, popular magazines such as McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's began a national trend of publishing scandalous exposés on powerful corporations, exposing corruption and social injustices. Publishers both benefited financially from the public's interest in social causes and provided publicity to catalyze change for them. Dubbed muckrakers by President Roosevelt, young, pugnacious writers sought to fix society's problems by arousing the public conscience. Upton Sinclair's 1906 book, The Jungle, created such public outcry over the exploitation and unsanitary conditions in the Chicago meatpacking industry that the federal government quickly passed both the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, the first federally mandated standards for companies who made products for consumption in the United States. Jack London wrote Call of the Wild, tapping into the budding concern of the urbanized nation over the loss of natural resources and the depletion of the country's environmental riches, an issue very near to President Roosevelt's heart. Other works unmasked the social ills of the women's white slave trafficking, the appalling living conditions of the poor, the unacceptably hazardous working conditions in industry, the blatant racism leading to oppression of minority groups, child labor, and the corruption of politics. Though not enough to cause social reform themselves, these works helped fuel the progressive movement.
Here's to the delver in the mine, the sailor on the ocean, with those of every craft and line who work with true devotion.
The movement that was started by the muckrakers began to escalate into what was known as the progressive movement. The more muckrakers brought their stories into the public eye, the more politicians were pushed to make substantial legislative reform. The reformers of this movement were mainly middle-class men and women who felt pressure from giant corporations, restless immigrant groups, and the aggressive labor unions. Their movement had two goals: to use the power from the state governments to limit the power of the mighty trusts and to control the socialist threat by improving the quality of living and labor. The progressives pushed for direct primary elections and the right of citizens to propose new legislation as to undercut the hold that powerful party bosses had on the legislative system. They also pushed for direct election of U.S. Senate members, a goal that was eventually achieved with the 17th Amendment in 1913. The progressives saw their biggest challenges in the major cities, where they attacked slumlords, juvenile delinquency, and the wide-open prostitution rings. Women, seen as guardians of morality and family life, used their positions as such to emerge onto the public stage. There they pushed for reforms affecting the domestic world, bringing about improvements such as clean water, trash collection, school lunches, community playgrounds, more adequate fire codes, and public libraries. They organized themselves, volunteered and lobbied for reform, becoming a powerful force first on the local level, then the states, then nationally. And their causes grew to include the fight against corruption, the struggle for fair wages and better working conditions, and racial equality. Organizations such as Women's Trade Union League and National Consumers League were created as a way for women to fight against the exploitation of sweatshops and for safe conditions for all workers. But they did not stop there. Empowered, they helped to create settlement houses, places where middle-class women who would otherwise have no opportunity to learn could go to be educated and find a place in public life. Women's rights activists began to help move the women's place from the home to the public world, and more women began to set their eyes on national suffrage for women, a dream that would not be realized until 1920.
And by union what we will can be accomplished still. Drops of water turn a mill. Singly none, singly none.
It is essential that there should be organization of labor. This is an era of organization. Capital organizes, and therefore labor must organize.
Women were not the only ones organizing during the early 20th century. Labor unions became an increasingly accepted force for change in the progressive era, one that gave the laborers themselves a voice to directly oppose the unjust policies of the companies they worked for. The workers from the Steel Range Company in South Bend in 1906 were not apart from this trend.
This being the first letter from Local 330, we would like to ask the brothers to pardon us, for we have not been organized but for a short time, and it makes it a little hard to get in line with. And I can say, since we have been organized, that the brothers are more charitable to one another, and it makes it a pleasant shop to work in. When organized, we need quite a number of repairs done about the shop to make it a respectable place to work in, such as the blower repaired, and also needed the prices adjusted. As we approached the Steel Range Company for these articles, they were very sympathetic with us. They speeded up the blower and put in a new one in the buffing room, which made quite an improvement to the place. When the prices were asked to be adjusted, the company took it upon their part to have our respected foreman go to each man and have him set a price on his work to justify himself, which will take effect the first of the year. We think the company will honor the conditions without any trouble whatsoever. We were all pleased to hear President Grout lecture on organized labor when he was here, and also to hear the Con Horn Manufacturing Company was organized, which will help our local. Our local has 22 charter members and have prospects for 3 or 4 more next meeting night, which is the second and last Friday each month. Hoping this will meet with your approval, I remain, fraternally yours, Arthur Reitzman, President Local 330.
Though South Bend saw its share of the occasional labor strike or push for unionization, unfortunately the community was never able to successfully unite all of its varied ethnic groups, and employers were able to manipulate laborers enough to keep workers from successfully organizing. Thus, though they saw their occasional successes, labor organization was never a prevalent, lasting force in the South Bend area. Still, the effects of labor unions made significant noise in other parts of the country, most notably New York in 1911, after the worst workplace tragedy the city had ever seen.
And I don't want your millions, mister. There's hard times somewhere every day. But all I want is a right to live, mister. Honest word for honest pay.
President Theodore Roosevelt saw the need for change and proposed a square deal that would keep corporations under control, protect consumers, and help conserve natural resources. The aim was not to redistribute the wealth, but to give the poor a fair shake at life. In 1902, the President's Square Deal came to the test when in Pennsylvania, 140,000 anthracite coal miners went on strike, fed up with their exploitation and deplorable working conditions. Working in mines was dark, backbreaking, and dangerous, and death and injury on the job were rampant. In a 1907 investigation into the Pennsylvania anthracite coal mines revealed that child labor was common in the industry.
When I was a boy, my dad said to me, "Stay out of mines, take my warning," said he, "or with dust you will be choked, and a pauper you will be, broken down, down, down."
I feel the dust upon my tongue, feel the pain down in my...
The miners demanded a 9-hour workday and a 20% pay increase, among other needed improvements. The mine owners, however, were confident in their position and refused to negotiate, let alone recognize the union. They believed that the public would back their position, forcing the strikers to return to their positions. As a 1902 pamphlet noted,
practically, the whole existing and available source of supply of anthracite coal for more than 20 millions of people in the eastern United States is a territory of 500 square miles, more or less, in the state of Pennsylvania. The mines within this region are owned by a very limited number of corporations and individuals. Not only is this ownership of the mining region thus limited and close, but these corporate owners, by arrangement among themselves or their stockholders, are for practical purposes a unit. It results from this that, for the coming winter, at least, and for years to come, for all practical purposes, the Pennsylvania coal mines, above referred to, will have a monopoly of the anthracite supply of the United States.
but as the winter cold set in and schools and factories were forced to close, public opinion shifted heavily in support of the miners. Roosevelt stepped in and threatened to take control of the mines himself, to have federal troops operate them so as to supply coal to the freezing public.
After this strike threatened great danger, President Roosevelt sent for Dare and the other railroad presidents in the coal region, and they came and lied to him. They told him they paid the miners 50% more than they did, and when the president asked them to arbitrate, they said there was nothing to arbitrate and asked for more protection and more troops. The report of the commission is a great victory for union labor. It shows that when the strike was entered into, it was the fault of the employers. This whole strike was brought about because the employers wished to destroy the union, and in the back of the employers were the great corporations of the United States and all the railroads. That is what is meant by these illegal and outrageous injunctions issued by tools of the railroad companies, issued by judges who are as much the servants of the railroads as their section men.
The bosses were forced to negotiate. In the end, miners received a 10% pay increase and a shorter 9-hour workday. However, the company still did not recognize the union as a legitimate entity. The incident led to the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which in the coming years of reform helped to break apart the gargantuan corporate monopolies and trusts that took advantage of the American public. As historian Kennedy Peale put it, trusts had come to be a fighting word in the progressive era, and Teddy Roosevelt was determined to respond to the public outcry against the trusts by curbing but not eliminating them. He believed there were good trusts with public consciences and bad trusts, greedy for power, and that the goal was not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. In 1902, Roosevelt was forced to challenge titans J.P. Morgan, and James J. Hill, who through the Northern Securities Company were attempting to monopolize the railroad industry. The powerful men responded to the president's antitrust suit with an appeal to the Supreme Court, who, to everybody's surprise, ruled in Roosevelt's favor. As the large trust dissolved, big businessmen were angered, and the public began to view Roosevelt favorably as a trust smasher. While as president, Roosevelt used his presidential power to bring down the big trust-busting stick on over 40 large institutions. He, in reality, remained moderate in his economic policies. He believed that government must have the power to regulate businesses in order to protect citizens. But he also believed that businesses who operated well should be left alone. Once in 1907, he even went so far as to put his support behind a business venture of J.P. Morgan's that involved the buying out of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company by the United States Steel Corporation. Working with President Theodore Roosevelt, Congress passed a slew of progressive-minded bills that protected consumer health and safety, worked toward better conservation of the environment, and reinforced existing economic regulations. In 1902, the Newlands Reclamation Act was passed. The act was controversial in terms of constitutionality, sparking regional and party tensions, but in the end was monumental both in the world of conservation and water and in interstate and state-federal relations. The bill put money generated from the sale of western public lands toward irrigation development projects, supporting and controlling irrigation on a grand scale, which in turn transformed politics, economy, society, and the environment. Settlers would then pay back the cost of the project to the federal government to help fund more irrigation projects elsewhere. Urged on by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, Congress passed the Elkins Act in 1903, outlawing the rebate system that large businesses often use to take advantage of railroads in the highly competitive market. After the publishing of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Congress was pushed to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, requiring the inspection of meat processing plants, and later the Pure Food Drug Act that required companies to label the ingredients on processed foods. The Hepburn Act, subject to furious debate and many amendments, was passed in 1906. The bill gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to set maximum railroad rates and restricted the free passes that railroad companies issued as bribes. The bill had the high approval of President Theodore Roosevelt, who constantly called for greater regulation of railroad companies. Across the country, citizens who were fed up with the corrupt and inefficient local governments began to initiate reform at a smaller level. State legislatures began enforcing reforms that took power out of the hands of party bosses and put it back in the hands of the American people. States put in place the secret ballot, allowing citizens to vote freely and preventing intimidation from the big party machinery. State reformers also put in place direct primary elections so that the voters were in control of who was elected, not the party bosses. Similarly, reformers pushed for the recall, which gave citizens the power to petition to remove corrupt elected officials. Citizens also gained more influence in legislative processes themselves. The initiative gave voters the right to petition state legislatures to vote on bills that they wanted themselves, so that they could not as easily be blocked by corrupt politicians. Conversely, the referendum gave voters the right to block corrupt bills themselves. In cities, progressives implemented the city manager system, first used in Galveston, Texas, in 1901. It was simple. The city council hired a professional city manager that would run the city affairs, reporting directly to the council. The goal was to eliminate partisan divides and corruption from running of the municipal administration. Cities also began implementing what was known as the City Commissioner Plan, which was similar in purpose to the City Manager Plan. It called for the hiring of experts to be in charge of a particular area of functioning of the city. A sanitation commissioner would be responsible for a city's sanitation needs, and so on. Thus, the Progressive era saw a cleansing on all levels of government that gave citizens more of a say in their governing.
Well, freedom's name is mighty sweet. All this world is gonna mean. But keep your hand on the plow. Hold on, hold on. I don't want
The years 1901 to 1912 saw huge leaps and bounds in the way a country's moral conscience catching up with its technological advances. Though the progressive reform of this era was not enough to fully deal with all of the nation's problems, where it lacked, it served to set the stage for further reform in decades to come.
Abuse and corruption reigned over the land. Tycoons held Washington in the palm of their hand. They bribed their way through Mark Twain's Gilded Age, till progressive reformers turned this damaging page. Big business and trust were run roughshod over. All competition and driving costs lower and lower. Then in 1890 brought the Sherman Antitrust Act, and monopoly no longer could block competitors' paths. Fighting for people's sake, fighting for a fair shake. A free market was a goal for progressives. So 2 more acts were set up to protect it. The Clayton Antitrust fought hard for free enterprise, and the Federal Reserve Act set up banks nationwide. Fighting for people's sake, fighting for a fair shake. Taking on greed and abuse, sounding alarms, exposing truth. Progressives protect us. Then came the muckrakers raking up muck, with their pen, paints, and pictures outrage soon struck. They exposed to the public truths, corrupt and unfair, feeling reality, unclothed and bare. Take a leap around life in the slums. Hungry children, rag pickers, hobos, and bums. And wielding a pen was Miss Ida Tarbell, condemning big businesses and newspaper articles. Fighting for people's sake, fighting for a fair shake. Taking on greed and abuse, sounding alarms, exposing truth. Progressives protect us. With optics and guns, jungle, the nation was shot. Chicago's repacking plants forever were rot. He rode a rat droppings, and poison bread, ground up and stuffed into the links we were fed. Fighting for people's sake, fighting for a fair shake. Taking on greed and abuse, sounding alarms, exposing truth. Progressives protect us. Taking on greed and abuse, sounding alarms, exposing truth. Progressives protect us. Thanks to progressive citizens can petition to place an initiative or a bill on that. The public can accept or reject it by referendum. We have the power. Thanks to progressives protect us. Elected
They said the building was fireproof, so on the 8th and 9th floors, where immigrant girls sold garments, they locked the exit doors. When the fire broke out that day, there was nowhere else to go. They could stay behind and die in flames, or jump to their deaths below. So say a prayer for the immigrant girls who died on that long ago day. Never forget the reason they died, and always remember their names. The fire engines came quickly as the crowd gathered in horde, but the ladders couldn't reach beyond the 6th floor. The girls screaming from the windows had only seconds left to decide what their final thoughts would be and which way that they would die. So say a prayer for the immigrant girls who died on that long ago day. Never forget the reason they died, and always remember their names. A memorial procession marched through a pouring rain. Mourners lined the New York streets, 400,000 came. Now once a year the church bells ring, for a moment heads are bowed in memory of the immigrant girls. Their names are read aloud. So say a prayer for the immigrant girls who died on that long ago day. Never forget the reason they died, and always remember their names.
beneath the tree, upon the schoolhouse playing ground which sheltered you and me. But none were there to greet me, Tom, and few were left to know. They played with us upon the grass some 20 years ago. The grass is just as green, dear Tom, barefooted boys at play, we're sporting just as we did then, with spirits just as gay. But the master sleeps upon the hill, which coated o'er with snow, afforded us a sliding place just 20 years ago. Running just as still, the willows on its side, larger than they were, dear Tom, the stream appears less wide. The grapevine swing is ruined now, where once we played the bow and swung our sweethearts, pretty girls, just 20 years ago. The spring that bubbled neath the hill, close by the spreading beach, is very low. 'Twas once so high that we could almost reach, and kneeling down to get a drink, dear Tom, I started so to see how much that I was changed since 20 years ago. Nearby the spring upon an elm, you know I cut your name. Your sweetheart's just beneath the Tom, and you did mine the same. Some heartless wretch had peeled the bark, 'twas dying sure but slow, just as the one whose name was cut died 20 years ago. My lids have long been dry, dear Tom. Tears came in my eyes. I thought of her I loved so well, those early broken ties. I visited the old churchyard and took some flowers to strew upon the graves of those we loved some 20 years ago. Some now are in the churchyard laid, some sleep beneath the sea, but few are left of our old class, excepting you and me. And when our time shall come, dear Tom, and we are called to go, I hope they'll lay us where we played just 20 years ago. I hope they'll lay us where we played just 20 years ago.
1900 loomed at hand, and rags to riches stories crept across the land, whispering into ears, this is your year, boy, this is your year. Andrew Carnegie epitomized hard work and relentless drive, not giving in to fears inside, total confidence and pride. Natural law, millionaire, let the markets be. Laissez-faire, you thrive or not, don't intervene, is black or white, no in between. The so-called wisdom of his day insisted science as a way. Something must be in his genes to bless this individual with means. They said that social Darwinism explained inequalities in the world we live in. Some have very special traits passed through generations. Gay, natural law, millionaire, let the markets be. Laissez-faire, you thrive or not, don't intervene, is black or white, no in between. Like evolution in the wild, every single woman, man and child, like survivor of the fittest is required, must have prosperity hardwired. This theory suited very well for 1,000 brand new millionaires who wanted eagerly to tell why they rose while others fell. A natural law, millionaire, let the markets be. Laissez-faire, you thrive or